Welcome to Parent-Tween Connection Talks, where we bring you insight from the experts who can help you navigate life with teens and tweens. I'm Clarissa Constantine, founder of the Parent-Tween Connection. I've worked with teens and their families for more than 2 decades, and I've come to believe that the more supported and knowledgeable parents and the other members of the proverbial village feel, the better they can connect with and advocate for their teens and tweens. And ultimately, that means we'll lose fewer kids to suicide. So Parent-Tween Connection talks about anything and everything teen and tween related. And we invite you to continue these conversations with us in the Parent-Tween Connection group on Facebook. So listen in, learn, and no matter what, keep connecting. Today we have the privilege of having Glenn B. Fair of Oakmont Law Group join us. He's the managing director and personal injury team leader at Oakmont. Originally from Huntington Beach, California, he joined the Army at the age of 18 and served as a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. While he was there, he was also a member of the division's skydiving demonstration team. After being honorably discharged in 1988, he moved to Nevada, had a short stint as a casino dealer and pit boss, and then began his career as a law enforcement officer. While he served the public, he graduated summa cum laude from the University of Nevada, Reno with a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, and ultimately retired in 2014 as a sergeant after serving his community for 22 years. But after retiring, he didn't stop. He moved to Wyoming and went to law school. Today, he focuses on advocating for folks who have been injured through no fault of their own, and isn't afraid to go to bat against big-time insurance companies who aren't taking care of their clients. Today, we talk about a follow-up conversation to the conversation that I had with Chris Mitchell during our last episode about insuring teenage drivers. Unfortunately, Glenn sees the other side of the coin and sees the things that can just absolutely devastate a family when they don't have sufficient insurance coverage. So listen in and understand a little bit better why Glenn says you really need to take the advice that someone like Chris can offer. Welcome to the next episode of Parent-Tween Connection Talks. And we have an attorney with us today. Now, many attorneys might say that they would want to be introduced something like this. Today, we welcome Mr. Glenn B. Fair, Esquire. But Glenn, something tells me that's not what you actually would want me to say.
No, I really wouldn't. That's kind of like stuffy lawyer talk. And I'm about as far from that as you can get. I mean, notice I don't show up in a suit. The only time I wear a suit is when I'm required to in court. Other than that, we just, our team and myself, we go as casual as we can. It doesn't mean we don't take your case very seriously, because we do. But our point is, we want to be approachable to everyone and say, hey, if you've got a question, give us a call. If you need to know something, don't be afraid to ask. And so we think this is the best way to do it, is not look like stuffy lawyers or talk like stuffy lawyers or act like stuffy lawyers.
Well, awesome. And Glenn, I'm super thrilled to have you with us today, because you definitely are not the stuffy lawyer variety. I know you have a pretty wide background as a law enforcement officer, and you're a father and a grandfather. And after you retired from law enforcement, you came into the personal injury world. And one of the things that I appreciate the most about you is that you are that resource of information. And so I really appreciate the fact that you took some time to be with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. One of my things that I have based my life on is living to serve.
Awesome. Well, so for any of our listeners, if you listen to one of our recent podcasts with Chris Mitchell of Mitchell Insurance Group, we talked about insuring teen drivers. And I shared that I had spoken with Chris on Facebook and that he was going to be in an upcoming episode. And Glenn reached out to me. We had talked about it before, but he says, hey, we need to talk, because people really need to understand the value of what Chris is saying, because I see it at the other end of the story when families end up underinsured and they just don't understand the legal implications of not taking the recommendations that Chris has offered. So when can we talk? And so again, I'm super thrilled to have you here. So Glenn, let's start with some basics. There's a lot of terminology in the legal world, the insurance world, that I know is super confusing to a number of us, especially a young driver. So what you had suggested, let's start there.
Sure. And the reason I do like to start with some of the basic terms is one of the things I hear very commonly when I speak to new or potential clients is, oh, I know I've got the right insurance because I have full coverage. Well, unfortunately, full coverage doesn't mean every type of coverage that goes on your car. It just doesn't, and that's fairly standard across the US. And one of the things I do want to clarify for the listeners is I'm licensed in Colorado and I'm licensed in Wyoming. I am working on getting licensed in Arizona, but just because I've only hold licenses in 2 states currently, doesn't mean I can't help out folks all over the country. I've got connections all over the country, and we can help others. Like right now, I've got a case in California that I'm helping with. I've got a couple in Texas that I'm helping with. So don't be shy about reaching out. So
Awesome.
when I'm talking in legal terms, I can tell you they are absolutely correct for Colorado. And for other states, I may need to consult with some more local lawyers, but I have lots of contacts. So we'll start with that caveat. So
Great,
let's go back
thanks for
to
clarifying.
Oh, no problem at all. So let's go back to full coverage. What full coverage means almost universally is that you've got liability insurance. Now, liability insurance is if you crash into somebody else or into their property, if you damage their property, your liability insurance is what will cover that. The next part of full coverage, if you will, is collision insurance. Now, collision insurance is when something hits you. In other words, you're driving down the highway and a deer jumps out in front of your car and your car hits it. Your collision coverage will take care of that type of a claim. And then the other type of claim is comprehensive. Now, comprehensive are not when you hit things, it's when things hit you, like hail. And we get hail here in Colorado, and I know in other places it can really damage and destroy cars, but comprehensive coverage is what takes care of that. So those are your 3 basic elements of full coverage. What they fail to mention is full coverage doesn't include some very important coverages that I believe are a must. One of those is called uninsured motorist or underinsured motorist. In some states, like Colorado, it's the same thing. In many other states, there's very different coverages, but those are very important. It's called U coverage, UIM coverage. Another term that we use quite a bit is med pay, which is just short for medical payments. Medical payments are not paid out to a person who you may have hit and injured accidentally. Medical payments pay you for medical bills incurred when you are injured as a result of a car crash, or you got hit by a car, or some injury you sustained due to a motor vehicle. So those are your basic coverage types. One of the other terms we talk about is deductibles. And what deductible means is that's the money you have to pay out of your pocket before your insurance coverage will pick up the rest of the bill. The way most of us experience that is in a comprehensive claim, a comp claim. Your car gets hailed on. You take it to the shop and they say, it's going to cost us, it's going to cost $6,000 to get your hail damage fixed. And what happens is if your deductible is $250, you have to pay the first $250, and then your insurance coverage should pick up the rest. Right. That $250 is your deductible. And Clarissa, thanks for putting this slide up on the screen. That's really helpful.
Yep.
Make sure we get everything.
Yeah, the only thing that I think we hadn't covered yet, and apologies if you're watching us on YouTube, I completely forgot to share my screen. The only one you haven't hit yet, Glenn, is rental coverage. What's involved in that?
So rental car coverage is basically coverage from your insurance company. So you can have a rental car in the event your car becomes disabled due to you hitting somebody, something hitting you. Basically, if there's an accident of some sort and your car is not drivable, it needs to be in the shop, rental coverage pays for that type of thing. It is not automatic on all policies. For example, in Colorado, it's not a required coverage. It's not part of full coverage. It's a
Right.
separate coverage entirely. And so I encourage people to get rental coverage. If you're in a crash, the other side, the person who, let's say a person runs into the back of your car, their insurance company is not going to pay for a rental car for probably close to a week or longer. But your rental coverage can pick up almost immediately. So there's a very big benefit to you. And rental coverage, along with like towing coverage, they're really inexpensive, really inexpensive.
Well, and to your point, if rental isn't part of quote unquote full coverage and it's not required to be added to a policy, somebody else runs into the back of you or T-bones you or something, there's no guarantee that they even have rental coverage for you. Is that correct?
Well, the way it works, if somebody crashes into the back of you, their liability coverage will pay. So they don't have to have rental coverage. Under the liability coverage, rental car for people's property you damage falls into that.
Got it.
And so the way this slide is laid out, the top 4 boxes all deal with full coverage.
So that's comprehensive, collision, and liability, and then the deductible is applicable as well.
Correct. Deductible applies to collision and comprehensive. The bottom 3 are not part of full coverage. So if somebody tells you they have full coverage, if you don't specifically get these 3 things on the bottom, you may not have it. A really good person to talk to, and I tell people this all the time, if you're not sure, talk to your agent. If you're thinking about switching, that's when you call Chris, who was on another podcast, who's awesome. I use Chris personally. He's a great guy.
Absolutely. All right. So let's talk about the minimums, because I know a lot of families, especially when we've got new drivers, they're balancing the fact that there's a sense of freedom for the 16-year-old when they get their license and they can go and do the things. There's a sense of freedom for mom and dad because mom and dad don't have to drive the kids to go do all the things. And at the same time, there's this enormous cost that comes up when it comes to insuring young drivers. So let's start with the state minimum, as you call it here.
Sure. So this slide basically lays out, minimum required coverages, and a word of caution to parents. Like I said, I'm a parent of 3 and a grandparent of 8. My children are all adults. My grandkids, thank goodness, are all below driving age at the moment. And so I don't deal with this as far as they're concerned, but minimum policy limits, minimum coverage, that is the lowest amount that an insurance company in your state will write a liability policy for. And that's the amount that it's literally the minimum required in order to legally drive your car in all 50 states. Now, I caution people, especially you parents who have teen drivers, many of you have assets like a house, a 401k, other retirement plans. I tell everyone, if you have these assets, you do not buy minimum coverage because you're asking for problems. And I'll come back around to that, Clarissa, here in a few as to why that's a bad idea. Because what people get caught up in is the short-term cost. So,
absolutely.
And the short-term cost can really damage you financially in the long run. And that's why I caution people not to do it.
Absolutely.
So I want to talk about what these coverages look like. And the screen, I'm not going to read the screen because everybody hates it when presenters just read their PowerPoint. But when we talk about minimum coverage and we talk about insurance coverage in general, you almost always see 2 numbers. You'll see 25,000 / 50,000, or you'll see 50,000 / 100,000. What that means is the first number, let's say the 25,000, that is the coverage for any one person. So if there's 2 people in the car and an accident occurs, and let's just say, hopefully it's not this, but your team is at fault, and you've got a 25,000, 50,000 policy, what that means is each one of those injured people has access of up to $25,000 into that policy. And the policy as a whole has a maximum payout of $50,000. And some folks go, well, that's $50,000. That's not a lot of money. Or that is a lot of money, my apologies. In the car crash and insurance world, that's not a lot of money. One trip to the hospital from a car crash case costs, I know in Colorado, if you take an ambulance, that's about $1,700 to go.
Wow.
Once you, yeah, right? And once you get to the hospital, the emergency room doctor, his fee, that's just his fee, is somewhere between $900 and $1,800, depending on where you go. And then we have the hospital bill itself, which usually runs somewhere between $8,000 and $10,000. Now, we haven't even talked about imaging, MRIs, CT scans, X-rays. When you go to the hospital in a car crash, especially a rear end type car crash or a T-bone type car crash, the doctors need to do imaging. Imaging at hospitals, I had a CT scan myself about 1.5 years ago when my wife and I were hit by a drunk driver. The CT scan alone was $11,000. And I didn't get a choice. I was in the emergency room and the doctor said you needed it. So you can see you will eat up $25,000 in coverage very quickly, which leads to the point of, well, if that's all the insurance there is, that's all the money they can get. And that is simply not true. All right.
And that, I think, is the biggest thing that a lot of people don't understand. I think a lot of people are like, oh, but my insurance will cover it. And if your teen injures somebody and their medical bills surpass 100,000, 200,000, 500,000, whatever, God forbid, where does that money come from?
Well, it's really going to depend on the person in the household. And remember, I talked about houses, I talked about 401ks and other retirement plans and investments. Just because you have insurance does not mean an injured person must accept your insurance. All right, they don't have to take it. Now, it's rare, I'll be very honest, it is rare that an injured person or their attorney, if they have one, does not take the insurance. But it does occur when somebody buys, like here in Colorado, a minimum policy. And so they've only got 25, 50,000 coverage. Their team driver makes a mistake. And we understand they're called accidents for a reason.
Right.
It's not like you do it on purpose. Your team makes a mistake, probably due to inexperience, or maybe they just made a bad choice, because we all know our teams occasionally make bad choices. And that's where I think we talked about no judgment. We try to teach them, we try not to judge them so they learn.
Right.
But back to the 25,000. If you live in Denver right now, I don't know of even the smallest homes for a 3-person family that aren't $400,000.
Correct. Yeah.
And because prices have gone up in the housing market, most people have at least $100,000 in equity in their home. Well, trust me when I tell you that personal injury attorneys, and that's myself included, we look at these things when we are evaluating a crash claim. And if you have purchased 25,000 minimum coverage for your team because it's cheaper, you're about to discover why it's not cheaper. If somebody's severely hurt, let's say it's an older person who gets rear-ended. When I say older person, I mean folks who are over my age, about 55 years old. And the reason I say that is because I'm starting to experience some of the things older people experience, like, you stub your toe and your whole leg hurts for a week. And that never happens when you're younger, right?
Okay.
And so older folks, especially in crashes, it's really easy to injure things like spinal discs.
Right.
A spinal disc injury I've experienced it personally, my clients have experienced it, and the medical bills alone on something like that are going to very quickly hit $100,000. And it's not hard to do it. I've seen people need spine surgeries from crashes 12 or 15 miles an hour. So your team doesn't even have to be driving, speeding, reckless, or anything like that. This can happen from even low speed collisions. And if that person calls an attorney, hopefully they don't call a TV lawyer. That's one of the things I like to say. Sorry to digress, Clarissa. Friends don't let friends call TV lawyers. If you want personal coverage, you call small firms, people who will hold your hand and take care of you. But that person calls a lawyer and they find out that there's a minimum policy, which they will find out. And in Colorado, the law mandates that insurance companies disclose that information.
Right.
And the attorney is also going to search the assessor's rolls for any property or homes or assets that the at-fault person may have. And if they find a $700,000 home and a $25,000 insurance policy, that attorney may very well elect not to deal with the insurance policy and to sue the parents directly and go after that asset that is their house. Now, does that happen often? No, it is quite rare, but it does and can happen, which is why I tell people your liability coverage should be a bare minimum of the value of your home.
Got it. And so that, I think that's the crux of it, is that when the insurance isn't sufficient, the person who was hit or injured in the accident that was caused by a teenager can go and sue the parents for, to recover damages or whatever the case may be on their end. And so the home being probably the biggest asset that somebody owns, or second homes, vacation homes, those kinds of things. In a worst case scenario, those things can be gone very quickly, is what I'm hearing you say.
It can. And again, I want to stress, I'm not here to spread fear and misinformation. It is rare that can occur, but it is a real threat. You've worked many of your adult years to own a home and to get things together, and you're trying to, you're trying to get your teen out in the world and let them learn for themselves. You really don't want to have all that threatened because you decided to save $50 or $100 a month on car insurance.
I will say the only car accident that I personally have ever been in was when I got T-boned by a 17-year-old kid. And one of the law enforcement professionals on site, when they came out to me, because my car was completely undrivable, was totaled, he said to me, at least at the time, that the most common age that he saw accidents happening for teen drivers was like 17, because they'd hit that point of like, I've been driving a year, I'm very comfortable, I'm more comfortable than maybe I should be. I don't know if that was your experience, if that's an official statistic or not, but that's what the professional told me on site. And she had just passed her 17th birthday, and I'll tell you, it was not a fun experience for me.
Well, and certainly not. And I'm glad you weren't permanently hurt. That type of crash can permanently hurt people, and unfortunately, I see it all the time.
Yeah.
You asked about statistics, and there's a reason insurance companies charge so much money for young drivers. And the reason is twofold. Number one, drivers under the age of 25 are the highest risk drivers in the United States. It doesn't mean your team is an irresponsible driver. It just means, as a nation, a majority of car accidents and insurance losses, if you will, occur from people who are under the age of 25. Males substantially more than females, which is why your teenage son is way more expensive to insure than your teenage daughter, because statistically, he's more likely to cause a crash. And again, it doesn't mean your teen is irresponsible. This is just national statistics.
Well, and to your point, accidents happen. And I think there's a distinction that we need to make between irresponsibility and simple inexperience. We become more confident drivers the more that we drive. And you see more situations, you can react more effectively. They just don't have that experience yet. So you mentioned at a minimum having coverage that is would cover the value of your home. So I know that you broke this out for us in terms of recommended coverage based on assets. So the way you broke it out was if your net worth, if you will, is under 100,000 versus over 100,000. Can you speak to that?
I certainly can. And so most of us who own homes, you've got assets over 100,000, especially if you're in a major city right now. Just because the cost of housing, as we know, has skyrocketed over the last 5 years. And so for those who have $100,000 or more in equity in their home, what I recommend is a liability coverage of at least the value of your home. Now, what that's going to look like for many people these days, let's just say it's 100,000. You're going to see, like it's on the slide, where you're looking at a 100,000, 300,000, 100,000 policy. What does that mean? It means each person in a crash that was caused by a driver will have access to up to 100,000 in coverage. For that one incident, each incident has a maximum of $300,000 in coverage. And the third number, the 100,000, that's the amount of property damage coverage that's involved.
Got it.
In Colorado, and I know Nevada, I believe California, and also Wyoming, you're going to see three numbers because property damage is separate from bodily injury.
Got it.
And I tell everybody, if you're not carrying $100,000 property damage as part of your liability coverage, you're making a mistake because I know Teslas and electric vehicles right now are very popular. And it's very hard to get one of those these days for less than about $65,000. And they total out very easily. So you need that higher coverage.
That makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah. And
again,
then go ahead.
I was going to say, I like the point that you say about referencing your deductible. A lot of people are like, oh, I'll take a higher deductible in exchange for lower premiums. I've made that decision myself, but I like the clarification that you make here of establish a deductible that is less than the amount of money you know you always have in the bank, because you can go for a higher deductible, but if you got to scramble to find that cash in the moment, that may end up hurting more than you anticipate.
Absolutely. Because the situation where it bites you, if you will, are, Colorado in the spring and fall, the deer and the other animals cross the roads on a regular basis. So we'll use that for an example. You hit a deer with the front of your car, you're going to sustain damage probably over $5,000. Now, if your deductible is $1,000, that means your insurance carrier is only going to pay $4,000 and you're stuck with the other $1,000. And you have to pay that money before your insurance carrier is going to write the auto body shop a check. Correct. And so if you don't have $1,000 in the bank, and if you don't have that $1,000, you're not getting your car back. And you're not getting your car fixed. And that just, kind of adds insult to injury. Didn't do anything wrong. A deer jumps out in the road. You weren't doing anything wrong at all. You still hit the deer and now you're $1,000 out of pocket. And so what I tell folks is, and statistically speaking, again, on a national basis, most people have less than $5,000 in the bank.
Right.
You don't want to have your car out of commission because you saved a few dollars a month, less than $100 a year on a higher deductible. It's just not worth it if you need your coverage. And I understand.
Yeah.
People don't have money just laying around that they can leave in the bank all the time. I get it. Just try to balance what you know you can come up with. It's a moment's notice.
Sure.
Versus how much you're spending on insurance.
Well, and I've seen some families actually, when they have teen drivers that get their driver's license, and they'll have a family contract around the agreement that the parents and the kids establish about responsible driving and behavior and such, that, you have to keep certain grades in order to keep your keys to the car, or, observe curfew, those kinds of things. I've actually seen some families include a requirement for their kid, if their kiddo has a part-time job or some such, that when they do add the teen driver to the policy, if they establish $1,000 deductible, for example, that the kid has to put that $1,000 in a separate bank account, so that in the event there's an accident, they have that money and they're putting that responsibility on the teenager. Or maybe it's, if it's $1,000 deductible, the kid has to have 500 because the parents agree to pay the balance, something like that. I've seen families incorporate that so that the kid recognizes, hey, I mean, yes, accidents happen, but it adds an extra level of responsibility for them if they know how many hours they had to work at their part-time job to put the money into that bank account to pay the deductible when an accident happens. Because I think that's the other thing, is it's really a when, it's not an if. We all end up having something, usually someone, somehow. So teaching them to have that set aside is often a good responsibility builder, but it's a good agreement for them to have. So then what's the difference, Glenn, for folks who have total assets under 100 grand versus over 100 grand? Like, what if somebody's not a homeowner, or that you were talking a homeowner of 100 or more? Do you still recommend for the under 100 that they have the 100, 300, 100 coverage?
As is so typical with attorneys, the answer is yes and no. I say, and I say yes because one of the theories I subscribe to is you can't have enough insurance coverage. But that, I understand, that is not realistic for a lot of people, and I get it. I've been in that boat myself.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got total assets under 100,000, let's say you don't own a home, and you're renting, you own a couple of cars, and and you're just doing your very best to get by on a day-by-day basis.
A lot of us.
Exactly. I mean, I totally get it. If you don't have anything to, quote, go after, this is about the only time I would recommend, or I would say it's probably okay to have what's called a minimum policy.
Okay.
Number one, they're less expensive.
Sure.
Number two, when an attorney looks at, well, what assets does this person have, and they discover, oh, they rent, they've got a small 401k. When I say small, we're talking about 100 grand or less. They've got a small 401k. The person doesn't really have anything to go after. Usually what's going to happen in that case is the attorney is going to have the insurance company pay out the policy, get a release of liability signed. That's the big thing. Release of liability signed in exchange for that insurance policy money.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes away, and there's no more headache for this person. And one of the reasons I do this talk is because I see all the time. I live in a neighborhood in Colorado, and we have an HOA and a Facebook page, and people keep talking about, well, it's X amount of dollars to insure my 17-year-old son, and he's never, he's a good student, he's never had any tickets. And they start talking about, well, we're going to buy him his own policy at this other insurance company, not add him to ours. And I just caution them that that's a real big mistake if you have assets. So that's the point. And I understand the other side of it is not everybody has a house. The
Mm-hmm.
housing market right now is made it so many people can't afford housing.
Mm-hmm.
And you're just, you've got to do the best you can with what you've got. If you have to go with a minimum policy, then that's what you do. My recommendation, and this is what I recommend to my own children, is the same thing I've told everybody else. Enough coverage to cover the value of your house.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you don't have a house, then at least $50,000 minimum. So it's not the minimum policy, it's one step up from the minimum policy. And that gets $50,000 per person. Mm-hmm. And $100,000 per accident. And it's a lot less likely that that amount is going to get exceeded in smaller incidents.
Right.
And it's more likely that the insurance company, there'll be enough money there to get payouts done and get a release of liability so that the at-fault driver doesn't risk their personal assets and things like that.
Well, or the at-fault driver in this case, doesn't risk their parents' assets, right?
Well, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah,
Because something that the folks who listen to this need to understand is that just because your child turns 18, it doesn't mean you are off the hook if they're driving your car and living in your home.
right.
You have responsibility to your team for basically the time they're living in your home. And barring a specific exclusion, which you can talk to your insurance agent about that.
Sure.
But a lot of college kids, they're still under 25. They're still in
Yep.
a higher risk group. They just fall into their parents' policy because technically they still live at home when they're off to college. And I
Right.
won't go too far down that road for now. We can do that another time if we need to.
I was going to say, and that's a whole other conversation. And so as I pulled up the slide here for anybody watching on YouTube, you can see it. For anybody who's listening that you can't see it, Glenn's clarified here that if you have assets of more than 100,000, or as he's mentioned, you own a home, a vacation home, if you're a business owner, or you, as he was just mentioning, you have kids in college, his recommendation is liability of at least 250, 500, 250. And he said that that's the 250 is the per person, right? The first one is per person,
Correct.
a maximum incident payout of 500,000, and
Yes.
then property damage of 250.
Yes.
And then the other distinction I notice here is that you mentioned an umbrella liability policy of at least $1 million. Can you speak to that briefly?
I can. So an umbrella liability policy is what kicks in if the harms that a person suffered because of a car crash exceed the limits of the what's called the underlying liability policy. That's the 250, 500, 250 policy. So
Right.
if that policy is not enough, then that's when the umbrella policy kicks in. And I've seen that happen. My firm has experienced that more than once in the last year. Teenage college driver caused a fairly severe crash. Young lady didn't do it on purpose. She wasn't even speeding. She just made a bad decision on her left turn. And unfortunately, my client, who was in her 60s, spent 5.5 weeks in a hospital, and 3 weeks in an intensive rehabilitation facility because her left leg and her left arm were broken and she could not handle it. In that case, that first 250,000 was gone before she ever got out of the emergency room. And thankfully, her parents had planned ahead. They have a very nice home in Littleton, and their liability umbrella policy kicked in and covered all those losses, so that young lady and her parents didn't have to pay 1 penny out of their pocket. And our client signed a release to relieve them of that responsibility of the injuries my client had suffered. And had they not had that $1 million liability umbrella, it could have been a different story for that family. And again, it was just an accident.
Right.
It was nobody was doing anything horrifically wrong.
Well, and so as we wrap up, if you've been listening to the podcast, you know that I like to ask our guests which of the foundations of connection speaks to them the most. And so when I asked Glenn in advance which of them he felt resonated the most personally, but also in the work that he does, he said non-judgment. So Glenn, you want to chat about that?
Certainly. And I say non-judgment, and I try to live this in my personal life and my business life. And the reason it's important to me is because we all have a hard enough time on a day-to-day basis, no matter who you are, getting through life and dealing with your own issues. And for many people, in this context, the car crash context, this is probably one of the worst days of their life to that point. Not always, but it ranks right up there. The last thing these folks need, the parents and the kids, the last thing they need is, to hear, I told you so, or, to have an attorney say, well, why don't you have more insurance? And things like that. It's not helpful. And in fact, I think it could be harmful. And I just believe that we're all on our own journey and we all have our own issues, and Clarissa is, I don't know what's going on in intimacies of your life, and maybe just being kindness and non-judgmental uh, in a day. It may just be that's what you needed to get through that day. I know it certainly applies to me because I'm an attorney and a grandfather and a father, and I have my days too. And the last thing I want is somebody judging me. So for me, non-judgmental, even when it's hard, is really important.
I love it. That's actually one of my favorites. So, well, Glenn, thank you for your time today. And I know that this is something, I get to spend time with you on a regular basis. I've gotten to know both you and your wife, Evan, personally and professionally. And I just appreciate the giver's hearts that you both have for helping folks. And I appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us here at Parent Tween Connection. And for any of you who are not yet members of Parent Tween University, you may want to check it out because Glenn is going to offer us another few minutes of his time to talk about what an attorney actually can do when your kiddo is in an accident. He's given you some recommendations so far about what kind of insurance policies and insurance coverages you need and why. And then he's going to talk a little bit about the benefits of hiring an attorney and some of the costs or not costs involved and that kind of stuff. So if you haven't checked it out, definitely do. And Glenn, thanks again. I'm super, super grateful for your time today.
My pleasure to be of service, Clarissa. You have an awesome day.
And that's a wrap on today's episode of Parent Tween Connection Talks. Be sure to check out the show notes for any links that we mentioned during our conversation. If you'd like a copy of the Foundations of Connection, you can find it right on our homepage at www.parenttweenconnection.com. And if you'd like to feel more supported as a parent and have a closer, healthier relationship with the teen or tween in your life, we invite you to join the Parent Tween Village. It's a judgment-free zone for the members of that village that it takes to raise a child. For just $19.99 a month or $199 a year, you'll join a community of parents and other supporters of teens and tweens who are dedicated to having the best relationships they can with the kids they love. You'll hear upcoming episodes live streamed into the group as we record them, along with exclusive bonus trainings from many of our podcast guests. You'll also be able to join our monthly group connection calls and other workshops just for members of the Parent Tween Village. You can join today at www.parenttweenconnection.com. And until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep connecting.